Good morning. I am delighted to welcome you again to Thursday Morning Torah. Today's class might be a little bit shorter because, as you might be able to surmise from my attire, I have a funeral, unfortunately, to go to this morning, and so I will need to duck out. But we are at the very end of the book of Leviticus. It's a double portion, Bahar B'chukotai. And since not only are we at the end of the book of Leviticus, but we are also coming up on Shavuot, I thought that it would be interesting today to talk about Revelation. And Revelation is the great theme, of course, of Shavuot. It's in some ways the great theme of the Jewish tradition. That is God's revealing of the Torah. And I'm going to talk about it from a particular point of view, or actually from several points of view, which is the way that different philosophers have conceived of this event, based on what we hear in this week's Torah portion. Now, as I said, it is a double portion, but I'm going to concentrate on the very beginning of the first of the two portions. The opposite, actually, of what I did. For those of you who are interested, you can read my Jerusalem Post column. It's on the word that begins the second part, the B'chukotai part, and that's available on the Jerusalem Post website. Just look under the Judaism tab. But the Bahar portion of the double portion begins with a discussion of Shemitah, of the sabbatical year. But it begins, the Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you enter the land, you shall observe a Sabbath of the Lord. 6 years you may sow your field, and then the seventh you let it rest. And the question that Rashi asks following the rabbis, which is a famous question in Jewish study, is Ma inyan Shemitah etzel Har Sinai? Why do you have to say that God spoke these laws at Sinai and then go on to talk about the sabbatical year? Most of the time, when the Torah talks about a law, it does not preface it by saying this law was given to Moses at Sinai. Why, in particular, is it important to say that about the sabbatical year? And the traditional answer, which brings us to the initial understanding of Revelation. The traditional answer is that God gave everything at Sinai, all the particulars as well as general principles. And therefore, even Shemitah, even the sabbatical year, even the agricultural laws, which you might think developed over time or were given at different times or whatever, no, that also was given at Sinai. And this understanding of Revelation, which is the one that most people assume is in fact the standard one in the Jewish tradition, is the understanding of Revelation that is in a lot of the rabbinic literature. The extreme statement of this, the one that goes the farthest, is the one that says everything that will ever be said by a student in a Beit Midrash in a house of study was said to Moses at Sinai. So that basically the entire history of Jewish interpretation was given to Moses at Sinai. This is the extreme view. It is not the universal view, but it is the extreme view. Then there are other views that are less, I don't know that extreme is the right word. It is the view that suggests, without using words that are value laden, because I don't want to do that. This is extreme and this is moderate. And if you like moderate, you'll like that one. I would say it's the view that assumes that God revealed the most. Let's just put it descriptively. However, there are a lot of other views in the Jewish tradition, and as Shavuot is approaching, it's worth at least hearing some of the panoply of revelatory schema. That is, the ideas of how revelation in fact happened and what was given at Sinai. So obviously, in some ways, if you read the Torah, you come away with the impression that what was given at Sinai was the Ten Commandments, and everything else was given later. And the given later view has a lot to be said for it, because first of all, as the rabbis themselves point out, it says in the Torah that Moses died. The last 6 verses of Deuteronomy are about the death of Moses. So was that given at Sinai? Some people say Moses wrote those last 6 verses crying. Others say that Joshua wrote them. But it opens the window into the difficulty of Moses receiving everything at Sinai. Because if Moses got the whole Torah at Sinai, then he knew that Korach was going to rebel, and he knew what he was going to say, and on and on and on and on, because that's still going to happen in the future, right? The Korach rebellion happens way after Sinai. And everything else that happens in the wilderness, 38 years worth of Israel's experience, was that all given at Sinai so that Moses, in fact, knew everything that was going to happen and everything he was going to say? Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So for some in the tradition, revelation is a continuous process. And this is important for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that what the tradition grapples with is, when does revelation end? There are some who say it ends at the destruction of the temple, the first temple, that the prophetic age is over then and there's no more direct revelation between God and human beings. Others sort of suggest that in some ways the rabbis are the inheritors and shapers of revelation, even if it's not direct, the rabbis being the rabbis of the Talmud. And there are certainly legends in the Talmud that suggest a certain kind of revelation. Every now and then rabbis are walking in the marketplace and they run across Elijah, and Elijah tells them what's going on up in heaven, which is a sort of secondhand revelation, but better, I must say, than most of us can do. And so there is an open door, but you understand that all open doors have dangers and difficulties. I'm loath to use the word slippery slope, because everything is a slippery slope, right? And it's just not true that if you make one concession, you have to make every concession. It's not true, for example, that if you sometimes punish your children, that means that you must beat them every day, right? People know how to draw boundaries, even on slippery slopes. And so it is possible to say that there was more revelation than just the word of God at Sinai, and still not to say that any Jew can do whatever they want, right? You don't have to make that big a leap that since revelation is ongoing. I had a revelation last week that, I'm allowed to have a cheeseburger on Yom Kippur, which I didn't, by the way, in case you were wondering. Such revelation was never vouchsafed to me, and I don't eat cheeseburgers anyway. So the moment, though, that you do say that it doesn't make sense that everything was given at Sinai, Ma'inyan Shemitah Etzel Har Sinai, why is it that it seems like all laws are given at Sinai? Well, truth is, it doesn't make that much sense, especially not for the narrative parts of the Torah, the stories that come after Sinai. Then you open yourself up to what is the nature of God and human participation in the crafting of the Torah. And here you get a lot of different kinds of answers all across the span of Jewish history. Some people will tell you that God gave general principles, and that the details of those principles had to be worked out by human beings for the simple reason that law is all local, right? There are all sorts of laws. For example, the Shemitah and the return, or the Yovel and the return of land to its original owner, that was sort of gotten around by something in the Talmud that Hillel established called the Prose Bowl, to enable people to make sales that actually counted so that it wouldn't destroy commerce. And when you look at how the rabbis treated the Torah laws, honoring them, but also interpreting them as legal scholars do, you understand that the idea that revelation was collaborative in a sense is in fact a very ancient idea, not just a modern one. And that God didn't give this and then people said that, but that there is some kind of interactive process then as there is now. For those of you who get the daily, well, now it's called Moments of Connection because it comes out 3 times a week. The little video that I do that gets sent by email, and sometimes I post it, and I posted it yesterday, it was about the idea that our blessing for bread, hamotzi lechem min haaretz, is actually inaccurate because it says God who brings forth bread from the earth. But of course, God doesn't bring forth bread from the earth. God brings forth wheat from the earth, and we make it into bread. So the collaboration of God and human beings, the shutafut, the partnership, which exists with many different things. There's no, I mean, the blessing that you make on a grape is the general blessing for fruit. Okay? But you have a very special blessing for wine. Why? Because it's a collaboration between God and human beings. And the point of the Moments of Connection was that the vaccine is the same. The vaccine is a collaboration using God's raw materials to reshape and make something that is a partnership between God and human beings. And so the very idea of the Torah for some scholars is the idea of a partnership. That is, there's a human input to the Torah, not just a divine input. And that's why, and by the way, interestingly, just as an aside, the Torah never says all these words of the Torah were written by God. The Torah doesn't make that claim of authorship for itself. In fact, if you were coming to the Torah and didn't know anything about it, you wouldn't think God wrote the whole Torah because God is spoken about in the third person. It said, and then God said to Moses. So who's saying that? And then God said to Moses. It sounds like the narrator is saying it about God. And there are many other reasons why people assume that there's a human partnership here. But that model is a model that I think the Jewish tradition, no matter what people thought of the authorship of the Torah, have followed ever since. Because the rabbinic prerogatives, the scope of their interpretive powers on the Torah are very great, such that they literally sometimes change the laws of the Torah, even though they don't say this law is inactive and this law I'm not going to do. But the way that they interpret those laws or the legal workarounds that they find, like the prose bull, in order to make it possible for someone to sell their land and not worry that the other person doesn't want to buy it because they're just going to have to return it to them. All of those kinds of legal workarounds are evidence of this sort of collaborative initiative. And I think that the Torah itself suggests this posture for human beings because, unlike other scriptures, the people in the Torah are A, flawed, and B, able to stand up to God. And that's a remarkable thing. So if they were perfect, then you would say, I understand why God created perfect people so they can stand up to God. But that's not so, right? There is no perfect hero in the Torah. Moses isn't perfect. Abraham isn't perfect. Nobody is perfect. And because of that, you would think that such people couldn't stand up to God, but in fact, they can and they do. And cause God to rethink, in quotes, God's own position. David is another example. And therefore, you would assume that the tradition that God gives human beings, since embedded in the very text of the tradition, embedded in the Torah, is this idea that there is a partnership, a collaboration of Moses, of Abraham saying, what about Sodom? You can't destroy it if there are good people. Or Moses saying, you're not allowed to destroy the Israelites. And if you do, destroy me. That the fact that there's a collaboration embedded in the Torah gives us this precedent for the idea that there's a collaboration in Revelation itself. Now, the most extreme on the other side, although I told you I wouldn't use the word extreme, but the part that says that God was the least propositional in Revelation, right? The revelation that we spoke about at the beginning is God giving propositions of specific laws to Israel. The least proposition is the one suggested by the modern Jewish philosopher Franz Rosenzweig, where he said, of everything in the Torah, what God revealed directly was the first letter of the first word of the Ten Commandments. Anochi is the first word, I am. That is, God revealed God's own existence and presence. And the first letter is an aleph, which is silent. So in the silence of that moment at Sinai, God's self was revealed to Israel. And the Torah then is what Heschel called a midrash. The Torah is the spinning out of that moment and the history of the Israelites that human beings created in fidelity to God's self-revelation. And you can see between these two poles of God said every single word in the Torah, or human beings wrote the Torah out of a reaction to God's presence at Sinai, and did so over many, 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 many generations. Between those two, there are infinite steps and theories to be developed and to be made. But the key part of this is that the Torah contains within it infinitudes. And that's sort of the fundamental belief, is you're not going to exhaust it. You can always return to it. It always has something to say. It always has guidance to offer. And if you don't find that guidance in the Torah, then it's on you. It's not because it doesn't exist there. It's because you haven't understood it correctly. You haven't turned to the right interpreter. You have it on and on and on and on and on. There's an old story about a man who goes to the Louvre and he sees the Mona Lisa and he says to the guide, you know, I saw the Mona Lisa. It's not so great. Honestly, really not that much. And the guide says to him, sir, we no longer judge the Mona Lisa. Now the Mona Lisa judges us. So I think that in some way that's true about the Torah as well. When someone says that I read the Torah and it's, you know, I didn't find that much in it, I think, okay, but that's not the Torah's fault. And so because we're coming up on Shavuot, I just wanted to give us to expand our sense of range of what it is that you can find in our sacred scriptures. Now, one of the people that I learned about the sacred scriptures from was Bert Vysotsky. And Bert Vysotsky is going to be teaching us tonight what exactly did God say at Mount Sinai. And you can, you know, I wonder what he'll say about it. He was one of my teachers and he's wonderful and entertaining and smart and funny. At 6:30 tonight, check Sinai Temple's website for registration. I hope that you will listen to Bert. He's written a number of books. He's a very, very eminent scholar and a terrific communicator. And I wonder what position he will take about it. But for us, I just wanted to give you the sense that there are a range of such positions, that you can see Revelation as something that human beings have to fill in, or something solely that human beings have to receive, or in between, as something that is a sort of collaboration between God and human beings, and that at each stage of human development, it appears different, is interpreted differently, is understood differently. Now, as I said, unfortunately, we don't have as much time this morning as we usually do because I have to go off to a funeral. But just think of human communication, which is the only model that we really have. Well, not the only model. I'll come back to that, which is one model that we have. Think about how much of what someone says you fill in. here I am talking to you, but you're not just hearing what I'm saying like an empty vessel, right? You're filling in from your own thoughts, experience, knowledge, guesses, assumptions, all of that, because we always actively listen, if we're listening at all. But another model I was just thinking about is sometimes when I walk in the neighborhood in the morning, especially these days, the birds are so loud that it's like being in a concert. And I realize I don't know what they're saying if they have a particular intent, but I know that I hear it as song because I listen with human ears and with my own ears. And so whatever God speaks, God's speech is conditioned by human listening. And whatever revelation is, it's got to be a kind of partnership, because we are not perfect recording vessels. We're not computers. We're human beings. And so we understand according to the nature of our own approach. And perhaps Professor Rozatsky will say more about that this evening, again at 6:30. But I want to thank you for joining me for this Torah class. I look forward to seeing you on Shabbat morning, when we will talk about the Torah portion. Again, I encourage you, those of you who are interested, my Clubhouse Torah tonight at 6 o'clock on Clubhouse is going to be, are Torah values liberal or conservative? And I will give you the answer, the definitive answer. At least I'll discuss it at 6 o'clock tonight on Clubhouse. And if you're interested in my Torah column, it's in the Jerusalem Post website or on my Facebook or Twitter, where I posted it as well. And that one is about Bechukotai. Okay.